Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jared Ledesma, Assistant Curator here at the Art Center and curator of the Hedda Sterne show upstairs. Before I begin, I'd like to read the Art Center's land acknowledgement. This land on which we gather is the traditional and ancestral land of the Native Americans who preceded us, and we honor those who are still with us. Thanks. So about a couple years ago, I attended an art history conference in Birmingham, Alabama, and I attended a panel on abstract expressionism, and one of the speakers presented on Hedda Sterne and these 7 paintings that she produced after John Deere tractor parts, and I was blown away. I had never heard of Hedda Sterne, I didn't know that these paintings existed, and I didn't know they were 3 hours away from Des Moines. So I thought it would be a great idea to bring them here to the Art Center and show them in an exhibition. So I'm really, really happy that we were able to do that. This afternoon we'll be hearing from Shaina Larrivee, the director of the Hedda Sterne Foundation and contributor to the exhibition's brochure, and Nathan Augustine, the art collections manager at John Deere Company in Moline. Afterwards, I'll join both of them on stage. We're going to have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to you for questions. So in consideration of time, I'm going to read both of their bios now, so when Shaina finishes her lecture, Nathan can jump on in and get up here. So Shaina Larrivee is director of the Hedda Sterne Foundation, New York, an organization established by the artist Hedda Sterne and dedicated to exploring her philosophy of art as a process of engagement and discovery. As its first director, Larrivee has overseen the organization of the foundation's collections and the development of various programs. Larrivee has overseen the organization of the foundation's Prior to joining the foundation in 2015, she served as managing editor of the Isamu Noguchi Catalog Raisonné for the Isamu Noguchi Foundation and Garden Museum. She has also served as publications director for the Catalog Raisonné Scholars Association. Larrivee received her MA from Stony Brook University, New York, and a BFA from Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston. She has written and lectured on various topics, including research methodology and the stewardship of artists' legacies. Nathan Augustine began his college career majoring in fine arts, but realized after his first year that he was just barely good enough as an artist to be frustrated by how good he wasn't. So he switched to history, but never moved far away from the arts. While he was in graduate school, he helped open Brigham Young University's new Museum of Art. From there, he has worked for 3 other art museums, helping 2 of them to open or move into new facilities. In 2010, he joined John Deere, where he manages the company's corporate art and historic equipment collections with responsibility for art, artifacts, and antique equipment on display at John Deere facilities worldwide. He also helped open the John Deere Tractor and Engine Museum in Waterloo, Iowa, which sounds amazing, and serves on the board of Quad Cities Arts. Nathan and his wife Carolyn are the proud parents of 4 children. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Shaina Larrivee.
Thank you so much, Jared. Thank you, Jill, and thank you to the Art Center. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to some dialogue. We were able to meet a little earlier and had this great discussion about Hedda's work, about the John Deere collection. I love the collection of antique machinery. So I hope we'll get to all of that. And I was asked to start here today with just kind of a brief discussion, just some context on the artist. So Hedda Sterne was a very prolific artist whose work intersects with some of the most important movements and figures of 20th century art. She lived actually to the age of 100, passing away just 9 years ago in 2011. At the time Hedda Sterne created the works on view here at the Art Center, she was a fairly well-known artist. She'd begun her career exhibiting with the Surrealists in Europe And by this time, 1961, she was one of the New York School painters whose work had helped define what would become known as abstract expressionism. But as we know, history is pretty fickle. In one of the very first books that came out that helped to define and give the history of the abstract expressionist movement, it's called The Triumph of American Painting by Irving Sandler. Hedda is mentioned just once, and that is only in reference to this photograph. So Hedda Sterne was not a fan of this photo, mainly because late in her life, it seemed she was only remembered for her appearance in it, not for her artwork, and that's not what any artist would want. But frankly, I tend to think that this is a helpful place to start, especially at this particular moment where in a lot of arts communities, we are very interested in looking back at some of the big narratives of art history and looking to see who and what we have overlooked in a lot of our textbooks and summaries and museums. And in this photograph, clearly Hedda Sterne is quite unmissable. And the fact is that she was every bit as serious an artist as many of her peers and friends appearing in this photograph. They're listed out here, but just to point out, Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, these are big names, and these are her peers. So some background on her biography. Hedda Sterne was born in Bucharest, Romania in 1910. She grew up inspired by the very radical avant-garde communities that were both there and in Paris at the time. I mean, Dada, constructivism, a lot of ism movements, but really just young radical artists looking to change the world. And by the late 1930s, her work was starting to be shown in Paris and earning attention from some important figures within the Surrealist circles. However, this is the late 1930s, and at the outbreak of World War II, everything stalled. In 1939, Hedda Sterne found herself stuck back in her native Romania, who sided with Germany in 1940. She was Jewish and really stuck in a country that was very anti-Semitic at a very volatile time. Eventually, after 2 years of limbo, it was a combination of good luck and good connections that led her to get a visa to immigrate to the US. It's a very long story and it's worth its own hour. I like to think of it as almost its own kind of precursor to the movie Casablanca. It's quite interesting, but Hedda herself was too shaken by her experiences, and in the end, she felt too fortunate to really justify embellishing any details, so she didn't tend to talk about her past. Because not only did she manage to leave occupied Europe at a time when so many others couldn't, when she came to New York, she also found herself right back on track with her art career and right in the middle of what would become the new center of the art world. The gallerist Peggy Guggenheim, quite an important woman, and her then husband, the surrealist painter Max Ernst, were Hedda's neighbors when she established a studio on East 50th Street, and they soon became very close friends. Peggy Guggenheim threw incredible parties, by all accounts. For those familiar with the great classic Auntie Mame, I think of that movie when I think back on, you read about these parties that Peggy Guggenheim threw, and she must have been an inspiration. And at these parties, Hedda started to meet and get to know many of her childhood heroes, these great artists whom she had admired while they were in New York, kind of in exile during wartime. Soon, Hedda's work was included at shows at Guggenheim's very influential Art of this Century gallery, and she was also included in the important First Papers of Surrealism exhibition of 1942. So she was off to a great start in New York. But that said, in many ways, Sterne never fully fit in with the Surrealists. She was a full generation younger and soon found her own community in New York. She met and later married the cartoonist and illustrator Saul Steinberg in 1943. And that same year, Betty Parsons began showing her work, and Sterne became a regular of Parsons' gallery. It opened in 1946, and the Betty Parsons Gallery was a center for the development of abstract expressionism. Sterne's work was shown alongside Pollock and Rothko and Ad Reinhardt. So fast forward to this photo. Given her unique background, I think the best way that Hedda tends to be described, her work tends to be described, is as a bridge between European modernism, particularly surrealism, and American abstract expressionism. She's a transitional figure in art history. But her work is also seen as strongly independent, and it's often reflective of the changing world around her, almost like a visual abstract diary. So let's take a look at some of the work leading up to the paintings that are here on view at the Art Center. So as mentioned, surrealism. Automatic drawing is the practice of allowing a work to develop without any intention guiding the hand. This was a surrealist practice that Hedda Sterne began working with early in her 20s, in the 1930s. But she would actually continue using that form of drawing as a practice throughout the rest of her life, including some of her last works made into her 90s. But perhaps her most successful early work includes collages like this one that use chance juxtaposition of found elements with drawing additions. After she escaped Romania and arrived in the US, she began working in another surrealist vein, exploring memories of her childhood in work that is sometimes pretty dreamlike. Here, this is a memory of her older brother as a child, Edward, at a violin lesson in their home. And I wonder if we can see this, but here's barely visible a little Hedda Sterne watching in the corner. But by the end of World War II, Sterne's work began to take on a quality that would become a mainstay of her practice for the rest of her life. She moved further away from the imagined world and now took more inspiration directly from her immediate surroundings. By the mid-1940s, she felt very newly completely at home in the US, and she was fascinated by what she found here. As an immigrant to America, she was keenly aware of a difference between the Europe she had grown up in and the US, and she liked to say that her immigration had felt like time travel. American cities, technology, and even the American mindset seemed somehow advanced. And the US, she liked to say, felt more surreal than anything the surrealists could have imagined. I love this quote. She says, "I became totally enthralled visually with the United States, so I became like a premature pop artist. I started painting my kitchen, like the kitchen stove, the bathroom appliances, everything where I lived. And then I went out and painted Ford cars and the elevated subway. And then I went to the country and I started painting industrial machines. And then I painted roads. I became visual when I came here." And we're looking at a painting titled Interior-Kitchen, numbered 14, is that correct? No. Thank you. My reading of Roman numerals not so great. But you can kind of see here, a kitchen cabinet, stove, pans, gas lines, the tile work. But then I also love how it becomes this cabinet with handles becomes like a face, and you have these arms, and there's this fabulous anthropomorphic quality where the kitchen becomes alive. So technology, as she's saying in her quote, she begins by painting her immediate environment in her room, and then she goes out into the world and she starts seeing magnificent things. And she liked to say that it was when she went to Vermont in 1947 and was staying in a house with her husband for the summer, and it was on a farm in Vermont, and she was able to see all this farm machinery, 1947. And at that point, she becomes fascinated by machines. Airport, 1949, so a few years later. But generally, technology became a huge interest. And by the late 1940s, she was gaining a lot of critical acclaim, great reviews, good shows for these so-called machine paintings. At times, they're very abstract. They might be of small man-made objects or large structures like she would have seen in and around New York during the post-war building boom. Other works function more like, the way I see it, portraits, giving some unique dignity to these man-made objects. And in this case, this is she just titles it Machine Motor. At times she also leaves us guessing what she's focused on. So it was during this period, this late 1940s, early 1950s period, that she took on her first commission from Fortune magazine. Fortune was and is, of course, a business magazine, but at the time it was rather exceptional for its use of color photography and a really innovative and I think unique practice of hiring artists and sending them out into the field as sort of de facto reporters to cover industry and business news. In 1954, Sterne was one of 7 artists asked to graphically interpret Joy Manufacturing Company's new coal excavating machine. So Sterne, along with Roberto Matta, Walter Murch, Rufino Tamayo, Antonio Frasconi, Ben Shahn, and Saul Steinberg, each produced something completely original, which was then reproduced in Fortune magazine in June 1954. Here's Sterne's. Her painting is on a round canvas, which she wanted to use to emphasize the effect of tunneling that the machine was used for, and the idea of it clawing through the ground. But this was also very in line with work that she was producing at the time, including several machine paintings done on round canvases, which were then, in the early 50s, exhibited at Betty Parsons' gallery, mounted on Lazy Susans so that visitors could spin the paintings and choose their own orientation. To me, this particular painting has a pretty certain kind of orientation. You can see a top and a bottom, there's a horizon line, but some of these are really designed to be viewed in any way. It's very interesting work. As the decade progressed, Sterne kept exploring and finding new arenas for inspiration as the world was changing. The bridges and the roads, like this painting, that she took inspiration from in the 50s are less portrait-like and more in the vein of urban landscape, I think. And like many of her contemporaries, her work became much more gestural and more in line with how we envision abstract expressionism when we talk about abstract expressionism. One of Sterne's major innovations at the time was her use of commercial aerosol spray paint, and I mean cans of Krylon. No one was doing this at the time, and canned spray paint was very new to the market, being developed in the late 1940s, but really only hitting hardware store shelves by 1952 or so. And you can see here this painting is dated 52 to 53. She's using these as soon as she comes across them. This series was very, very well received. Her machines were thought highly of, but then this body of work was very seriously collected during its time. So In the 1950s, MoMA, the Whitney, the Art Institute of Chicago, and many other major museums were buying these works directly from exhibitions that they were in. And I know for certain that the painting MoMA purchased and the painting at the Whitney, both of those are on view at the moment. I think the same is true for the Art Institute of Chicago, but let's say it is. Yeah, didn't check. But by the end of the decade, when Sterne was approached by the New Fortune Commission, she was really no longer painting machines per se. Even though she was paired with Deere Company, and I think it obviously went very well. The resulting work is very unique, blending themes of the past decade that she developed. For the assignment, Deere Company took her on a small, what she described as a small two-seater plane, and flew her from factory to factory. She saw, she described it, the machines that make machines. And she had complete editorial freedom from Fortune to focus on whatever she chose. So she was particularly drawn towards what she termed parts and processes. The results combine her, what I think of as her machine portraiture from the early decades with the experimental use of materials and techniques from the second half of the 1950s. But one major through line for these paintings, the ones before and after it, is Sterne's power of observation and her ability to translate not just kind of the hidden beauty in everyday objects and places, but to also convey her sense of curiosity. She liked to say that the best thing about Leonardo da Vinci's drawings were that they were made not for beauty's sake, but in order for Leonardo to explain something to himself, for him to explore and understand something better. And that's something Hedda took to heart very early on, and I think when you understand that part of her practice, you can see that in her work. So the Combine was one machine that she was particularly in awe of after her tour. In an interview that she did years later, she sounds still fascinated by what she learned on the trip. She recalled meeting a farmer who was staying at the same hotel for a convention, and she spoke to him, and he told her how he was able to manage a huge, in her mind it was hundreds of acres, and I have no idea, I'm sure she didn't either, but a large farm practically on his own with the aid of a combine tractor. And I think here there's kind of a sense of her paying homage. We were talking earlier about this having almost the effect of a religious icon, like a Madonna and Child, and the use of the baby blue spray paint creates this kind of distance and this feeling of almost a monument in space. I'm looking forward to talking more to Nathan about what exactly she's depicting, because again, her interest was in parts and processes. So she was not in any of these paintings that I'm aware of doing a whole machine. She was focusing on a small part as she's seeing it in the factory room. So Sterne was also deeply inspired by the innovation that she witnessed. John Deere had either just released or was just about to release the brand new 6-cylinder engine it had developed. Fortune, when it ran the article in July 1961, included quotes of Sterne's commentary about the work and what she witnessed. So on the new engine, she said, quote, "There is nothing else in the world made with such extreme care as these things." And she described what she saw as like sculpture by accident, something that was made beautiful in its design, which was originally just meant for the need of function. She was very, very impressed with the technology. So it's also been enlightening to learn more about the sources from these paintings. Sterne is quoted in Fortune saying that she worried that the workers would really dislike the paintings and say that they wouldn't work the way that she painted them. So Nathan, I'd love to know what you have to say about that, because these paintings now spend a lot of time hanging in the Deere Company headquarters and are often seen by people who are very familiar with these parts and processes. And because I want very much to kind of head on and have this conversation, I'm going to end with just a quick thought. I think that some of Hedda Sterne's most powerful works are directly related to the immigrant experience, and these are among them. Sterne gives us a view of the U.S. at mid-century through the eyes of a woman who was fluent in the language of surrealism, and she was truly she was truly in awe of what she found in this, her adopted country. She would often visit France and Italy for extended periods of time, but ultimately she chose America as her home. And it seems to me that she never stopped looking with a sense of curiosity and awe at the country and what she found here. So this is what makes these paintings, which are inspired by such a quintessentially American company, John Deere, so powerful. And that's my thought. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to share what I consider to be some of the absolute gems of John Deere's art collection. I often get asked, why in the world does John Deere have an art collection? We're not the kind of place that you'd think would collect art, especially not great art. And part of the answer is that we've always had some art. All the things you see here date from very early on in the company's history. The Leaping Deer sculpture, we have 14 of these, and they date from the 1890s. This is a portrait of Charles Deere, John Deere's son, our second CEO. It's 1908. And this is an illustration done for calendar art, basically advertising, that's from the 1920s, or 30s. And the other part of the question, the other part of the answer is this gentleman right here. Bill Hewitt was the last CEO to be a member of John Deere's family. He married John Deere's great-great-granddaughter. And he was everything you'd think of when you'd hear international playboy of the 1960s. He traveled the world as the CEO of this corporation, and he also built this building designed by Eero Saarinen, so a connection here to the Des Moines Art Center. And when the building was completed, people started to move in, and they complained that the building seemed very stark and empty. It turns out that the walls were white, the floors were white, the ceilings were white, and when they asked Saarinen about this, he said, well, the people will provide the color, which he specifically meant the women, because all the men were wearing dark suits. And we found out, actually just about 3 years ago from his son, that Eero Saarinen was colorblind. So from his point of view, it didn't matter what the color was, everything looked the same. But Bill Hewitt took this thought that the building looked empty, and he decided to fill it full of art. And he actually had a couple of really good business reasons for doing this. One of which was he wanted the environment that the people worked in to reflect the excellence that he wanted them to produce. And so he went out and collected excellent works of art, including Hedda Sterne. And the other was, this is Iowa. His employees were your typical Midwestern farmer type of people. I don't mean any disrespect to anyone, but their horizons were limited. And Deere was expanding overseas at this time. They were opening factories in Mexico. They just bought a big company in Germany, Argentina. And so he wanted to introduce new ideas and new cultures and new ways of thinking to his employees. So he did that by traveling all over the world, often with his wife, who was a force of nature in of herself, and started collecting art. And he purposely went out of his way to collect things that he thought would shock and especially make people think. He really wanted his employees to think about new cultures, new ideas, and to have that fuel their creativity as they solve the problems of making these hopefully excellent machines. And enter Hedda Sterne. As far as I can tell, I work in the John Deere archives, and so I've got access to pretty much all of the recorded history of the company. As far as I can tell, these are the first pieces that he bought. And they predate any other pieces that he bought by at least a year. So I think that, and the other half of that is they also were bought about 2 years or so after the Fortune magazine article came out. So Bill Hewitt would have been personally involved in arranging Hedda Sterne's meeting and tour, and then he would have seen this this article, and then this building was being built at the same time. The building opened in 1964, and he was very, very much involved with the architect in designing the building. So he comes up with, or he encounters this problem of the building being stark and empty, and at the same time, this artist has just produced a body of work relating to John Deere tractors, but in a way that's very different from what most people think of when they think of tractors. And I think he had an aha moment and decided that based on what his encounter with these paintings, that he decided to create the John Deere Art Collection. And it is not just a bunch of landscapes. This is the main hallway on our main floor. If you enter the building, you walk down this hallway. Hedda Sterne's painting actually usually rests, one of her paintings anyway, usually rests right about where this camera took its shot. If you were to turn around, you'd see 6-cylinder engine right there behind you. And once again, I get asked, even by employees, why does John Deere have an art collection? What benefit is there to John Deere to have this art? And I have found a number of very important reasons. It does provide an environment of excellence. I was required to take everything down off of 4 floors worth of this building, about 750 works of art, take them all down, store them, put them all back up again in about a week and a half. During that week and a half, when there was nothing on the walls, I got call after call after call and comment after comment. Where did it all go? So it really does provide an environment of excellence. Another way that it benefits the company is in the opportunity it gives us to interact with the community in an event like this. And so thank you to the Des Moines Art Center and to Jared for inviting us here and discovering these paintings and wanting to share them with you, because again, as far as I can tell, they've never been exhibited as a group before. And we get to advertise, in quotes, to an audience that we don't normally reach. And to me, that's very exciting and very helpful to the company. And so I'd like to also talk about something that Shaina alluded to earlier. These paintings straddle a critical moment in John Deere history. And I don't know how many of you are tractor enthusiasts, but you'd have to be a pretty good tractor enthusiast to know what I'm referring to here. But the title of this one is Main Transmission Housing for an 830 Tractor. And the title of this one is Six-Cylinder Engine. This one is one of our most popular pieces because it's recognizable. You can tell what it is. Shaina asked about me discussing the parts. Several of these are challenging. I don't know what they're referring to because they're so abstracted. But these two are pretty clear. And just on the off chance, does anyone know what the pivotal moment of John Deere history would have been that these two paintings cross? Exactly, says the man with the John Deere sweater. So up to this point, up to about 1960, John Deere was producing two-cylinder tractors, and they produced some pretty big ones. This is our biggest John Deere tractor, an 830 tractor. So that transmission housing would have sat right back there. And this right here is the cylinder that runs it. So it's big, it's like this big around. So they'd reached the maximum that they could have done with engineering power with a two-cylinder engine. And two-cylinder engines had been wildly popular for John Deere. But John Deere had always been a strong number two, but number two in agricultural manufacturing. With the release of the new generation of power and six-cylinder engines, and this is the tractor that it came out, the biggest tractor that it came out in, the 4020, which was the Chevy Bel Air of 1960s tractors. We jumped ahead, and we became the most important, or the largest and most important tractor and agricultural manufacturing company in the world. So it's, and most Deere employees don't realize these connections and this import. I tell them, I share them with them when I get the chance, but these are critical to not only the mission of creativity, but also to the idea and the history of John Deere as the leading agricultural manufacturing company in the world. And I thank you very much.
Let me get situated here. Thank you both. That was great. Well, immediately what comes to mind is your question about the paintings and how Hedda was concerned about the staff at John Deere and how they felt about them. And I would love to pick your brain about, like, over the past few years and how the staff has reacted to them. In particular, are there arguments about where they live? Do some people want them in their offices, or?
We don't let these particular paintings go into anyone's office. They're out where they can be seen by the entire company, by everyone who works there. They are well liked. Six-cylinder engine especially is an icon of the company. People walk by and comment on that painting when I'm walking around. And I think not only because it's recognizable, but because, as you were talking about, it's one of the portrait versions of this set. It looks like, not just like an engine, but it looks like something important in a landscape. It's iconic.
I think what you just said about them being portraits, and Shaina, you talk about this in your essay, and you spoke about that earlier. And what I liked about what you said also is that she thought of herself as bringing life to these objects, or to the kitchen, to the stove, to these tractor parts, and like giving them an energy. And I think that's really important about her, is that she had this eye for things. Can you expand on that a little bit? I love that.
I think I would go back to what I mentioned about what she liked about Leonardo drawings. That she was, a word I find myself using regularly when I talk about Hedda Sterne and her work and her philosophy, is exploration. That there was an element of her using her art making as a way of trying to explain something to herself. So whether it was, one of the things that she said in the many quotes included in the Fortune magazine article were that she was trying to not to understand how the parts work, but how they are. And I feel like that's a very artist thing to say, and I can hardly probe that comment enough to understand exactly what her point is. But she had a curious mind, and when she found something that spoke to her not just aesthetically, but functionally, she would get really hooked on that object, that landscape, that even philosophy. There's a later series of work that is about kind of her interest in signs and symbols, and it looks like almost these imagined architectural spaces that are so cool. And it goes back to the comment that her work is kind of a visual diary of her experiences, the world changing around her. It's very private, but always based in reality. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
You just mentioned the article, and I think I'm remembering correctly how the first, maybe the second paragraph in the Fortune magazine article, they call her sensitive, a sensitive Romanian-born, and I feel like that word is really charged in a way when looking at it from 2020, looking back into, womanhood in the 1960s. But I also think it's also kind of accurate in how she was kind of sensitive to the world around her. How did she feel about being a woman artist in the 1960s? And do you know, was she called sensitive before, or is this?
Yeah, and like many women artists, she did not like the distinction of being a woman artist. It felt like something secondary. She was an artist. There were no men artists. She was an artist. So that's something that she was sensitive to. But yes, in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the major writers and critics during this time period, Clement Greenberg, who really made the career of a number of artists, he had written a review of one of the shows of her machine paintings in, I want to say 1947, maybe 1948. And there's a sentence that reads like a bit of a jab. It's like, these are great paintings, but, she's a sensitive artist. Mm-hmm. I'm very much paraphrasing there. But I think that was a very gendered term at the time, and I'd love it if we can accept it without that stigma, because you're right, in a lot of ways, it is sensitive, in the same way Rothko is sensitive, and many other artists are sensitive. That's a feature of artists, their ability to be sensitively attuned to their subjects in order to create something that relays that, their artistic intentions.
All right, Nathan, I have a question for you. So when I was at John Deere headquarters and just looking at Saarinen design for the building, there's a lot of, similar to here, there's a lot of symmetry and lines. And in Hedda Sterne's paintings, there is a lot of symmetry as far as lines and kind of this grid. Was she aware that Saarinen was chosen for the design for the headquarters, or?
The headquarters would have been under, a lot depends on the timing of when these were actually painted. We were talking about this earlier, that there's no clear timeline for when exactly these were painted and when the tour came, though you gave me another clue as to where to look. We have very good flight logs, so that might be the answer. But I'll dig and we'll look. But depending on when they were actually painted, the building came under construction in '60. So, but it wasn't finished until '64. So even if she was aware that the building was being built, she probably wouldn't have had much of an idea of what it would look like. There was a model created, a large one, And so there's a chance she would have seen that, but I have no way of knowing.
I would guess that given the way she talked about her experience on the tour, she was given the royal treatment. She was actually quite surprised to find herself treated like a member of the press who was doing a promotional piece on the company. You know, she was covering John Deere for Fortune. So they treated her very, very well, and they flew her around in this private plane. She mentioned in one interview that she was even shown videos of how certain tractors work. So if there were even the remotest sketches of plans, I'm sure that it would have been included in her tour of
Well, that very much goes with Hewitt's personality, and he was very, very proud of this building. He was knee-deep, at least, in everything about the design. He helped design the tableware that went in the cafeteria, etc. So that being the case, there is a good chance that he would have shown her where they would be exhibited eventually. Yeah.
That's great, thanks. Part of what's great about showing these works here at the Art Center is new research, which is always fun. And when I went to look at them, the medium descriptions, I think they were like oil and enamel on canvas for all 7 of them. And then you went to look at them and discovered that they're not all oil and enamel on canvas. And can you talk about that kind of discovery?
Well, I always find myself with Hedda at a loss for not having studied conservation. I really need a background in chemistry because she was very experimental with materials, and I think the use of Krylon spray paint is just one example of the way she was innovative and experimental. So traditionally, and here's the full, how do we end up with the titles, the dates, and the lists of materials that are on any artwork that is hung anywhere? A lot of times that information just comes with the work. And it's very rare that you actually have a professional looking at an artwork and saying, now that is actually crayon, and that is Conte crayon, and this is graphite but not pencil. There's various, what a conservator and what an expert can really say about a work is far beyond what many of us can do. And I know that the work came to the John Deere collection directly from the Betty Parsons Gallery through Stern's studio. And we even saw the invoice in your archives. And the invoice for the Betty Parsons Gallery just gives the date as 1961, and it just says oil on canvas for some of them and mixed media on heavy paper for others. So there's one thing that didn't get translated because all the works, like you said, when you saw them, they're listed as various materials on canvas. Well, that overlooked the on paper, so we were able to correct that, looking closely at the work and noticing, yeah, these, and you'll see in the Art Center that all of them do look like they're on canvas, but all 4 of the smaller pieces, if you look closely, you can see the edges of paper mounted on canvas board. So that's some careful looking. I don't have the skills to be able to identify every single type of material, but the spray paint is very clear, and it's only been in the past year or so that I've been working with a conservator, an expert in materials, who was able to come up with some color charts from Krylon from the time period. So you can look at a particular color and you can say, gosh, was that did she just put oil paint in a spray gun? What's happening here? But when you actually look at the color, you can say, oh, no, that's 1959 sky blue, or, So we've been gaining more and more information, and we've been able to slowly make suggestions about how to treat dates and lists of materials like you said, this exhibition was a chance for that kind of observation and research. And hopefully someday in the future, there'll be another chance for someone with even more knowledge to go through and say a full list of what's going on there. Yeah.
Thanks. I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Nathan, I like how Hedda, she talks about, well, it's quoted in the article, she talks about the designers of these parts as being artists themselves. And I'm really curious, do you know if Bill Hewitt thought of the designers of these machines as artists, or were they given special treatment? Or
You've brought up a topic worthy of another full lecture, at least. Actually, Jill, could you go to my extra slide? So, original John Deere tractors, way back in the 19-teens, were industrial. They were just done. But then in 1936, John Deere hired the leading industrial designer in the world at the time, Henry Dreyfuss, to design our tractors. And if these are some of the other things that Henry Dreyfuss has designed, I've touched every one of these, and I'm not all that old. So he was world famous for his industrial design. And if you go to the next slide, he designed these three tractors. And the 530 is the younger brother of the 830 tractor that Hedda Sterne painted the transmission for. And the 4020, the one at the end here, is the new generation of power that she painted the 6-cylinder engine for. So, and that just is the beginning. It was through Henry Dreyfuss that Bill Hewitt was introduced to Eero Saarinen. And it was also through their cooperation and friendship that they were introduced to Alexander Gerard, who did all of the interior design for the exhibit. And Alexander Gerard is one of the leading mid-century modern furniture designers and artist in his own right. So he was an industrial designer, not an artist, but he was very much a key part of John Deere history. And engineers at John Deere are still kind of the royalty. The industrial part of it, they weren't, again, considered artists necessarily, but they're certainly very important to the company and how it works.
okay, let's open it up to you all. Do you have any questions for our speakers?
That middle tractor that you had a photograph of, the grill looked like the design of the building. Was that taken into consideration?
That tractor was designed, that grill pattern was designed in 1936. So it predated the design of the building by several decades. That said, I can't say that there's not any sort of convergence, but if there was, it would have been the other way around. The tractor grill would have inspired Eero Saarinen instead of Saarinen inspiring Henry Dreyfuss.
Would she, when she was flying around to these various places, would she paint or draw on site, or would she take this information or take whatever she saw and take it, you know, to sort of take it with her in her memory or whatever she would? So that's kind of my question.
That's a great question, and I would love to have a really firm answer for it. It's very likely that she carried a sketchbook with her. I've seen some small sketchbooks that have sketches of machines that you can then see more abstracted in canvases, and I'm still dying to see if she kept that John Deere travel book. But you know, there's still more to dig through, so maybe more soon.
I was curious if Hedda was a financially secure artist, and also kind of curious what John Deere paid for these paintings, since you said you saw the invoices.
We have an invoice. They're very reasonably priced. You know, I've always wanted somebody to go through various gallery archives and do a full comparison between what male artists' prices were in 1950 versus female artists, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. She was, this goes a bit into her biography. When she was a young woman, she was married in Romania to a man who worked in business and became very successful. So her first husband supported her financially quite well and gave her the freedom to develop as an artist. After the war, they divorced. She met Saul Steinberg. They got married. And the way she talked about her kind of financial situation with Saul was that they kind of took care of themselves. Saul made a lot of money kind of working various commissions, The New Yorker, everywhere. Saul Steinberg is one of the most recognized illustrators of the 20th century. But he also supported a number of family members from back in Europe after the Holocaust. And she, I think Hedda supported herself through the sale of her paintings and by just being kind of conservative with what she had left over from the previous iteration of her life when she did have a lot of financial support from her first husband. At times, I think things were tough, but she lived a pretty Spartan life by choice.
So the building was built a couple of years later. Did Hedda Sterne ever go and visit John Deere headquarters?
I doubt it. This was not her only visit to the Midwest. And she also, I think she did a semester of teaching at Carbondale. But I don't know if she ever came back to Moline. Certainly not, I hadn't heard anything like that.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything like that either. I don't have any record of it happening. And that was something that probably would have been recorded had it happened, because we had a number of fairly big names come through our headquarters at various times, and that's been well documented, so I would assume this would have been too.
Hi, I guess this is a question for you about the John Deere collection. You said that Hedda was kind of the starting point for the collection, and it's a two-parter. Did they ever purchase any other works from Hedda besides the pieces that we see here? And you've talked about kind of the collection as a whole, what it represents, but maybe in more artistic terms. It's got 750 pieces. What kind of art do you collect or have you collected over the years?
So no, we didn't collect anything more by Hedda Sterne, and that's one of the challenges that I have with the collection. Almost everything we have is one-offs. We have one painting by an artist and one painting by a different artist. And when Bill Hewitt collected, there is no unifying theme, except it maybe anything that interested him from anywhere in the world. He traveled the world collecting art and rarely collected more than one thing by any one artist. So it's really tough to, I guess the unifying theme would be cutting edge abstraction or cutting edge art in general from all over the world.
My question is, if any of us wanted to visit your collection and maybe have a tour of the architecture and the art, is that possible?
Actually, yes, it is. We have our guest services group does tours of the building, which focuses on Saarinen's design and how functional it is and how useful it is still, and also just kind of general John Deere history. But then I also give tours to, usually to groups, but if you were to drive to Moline from Des Moines and let me know that you were coming, I could arrange a tour for you. I don't have the resources to give a tour to 100 people a day, but I do occasionally do that and am happy to show our collection. It's a private institution, it's a business still, so it's not open to the public, but with careful advance notice, I am willing to give tours, especially if it's for a group.
That could be an incentive for the docent program, maybe?
Hi. Earlier, I believe it was you that mentioned the work of some other muralists. And we know, for example, that Diego Rivera got into trouble with the Rockefellers. I was wondering, has Hedda's work ever caused any controversy at John Deere?
I'd love to know that too.
Not to my knowledge. Like I said, Bill Hewitt went out of his way to get stuff that was weird from a Midwestern, conservative point of view. And he really pushed that on the employees. Not in a negative way, but he said, this is what you need to know and understand to be able to meet the challenge of selling tractors throughout the world. And he was a very creative person. And he wanted his employees to be creative people. And so again, he said, this is what you need to understand to do your job well. So as far as I'm aware, no. We don't have any Diego Rivera, but we do have some other Mexican muralists who were kind of in the same vein. We have a series of prints by Siqueiros, if I'm not massacring his name too badly. Yeah. And he was a contemporary and just as, not as famous perhaps, but just as embroiled in Mexican politics as Rivera was. So again, these were promoted as important things that people need to understand, and not, as far as I'm aware, they did not generate any controversy because people were saying, okay, this is what we need to learn.
I want to add to that real quick. I think that in these times we think of a division between fine art and the real world, and that certainly existed at the time. But I think that maybe the division wasn't quite as great, and there was more optimism about how art and culture can be integrated into everyday life, that thought less of the fine arts as something completely other that you need a degree to understand. Fortune magazine is a great example of this, and in fact, so is Life magazine. Fortune magazine was founded by one of the titans of American media, Henry Luce. And his original intention with Fortune was to integrate fine art and large color reproductions into the magazine as a way of kind of shedding new light and interest on business and industry. And this was not a completely uncommon idea. So I think that Bill Hewitt's notion of let's fill the halls of our new building, which is a very progressive design, let's fill it with progressive art. I wouldn't even see that as kind of forcing it down the throats of his employees. I think it would be par for the course in kind of providing something lovely, beautiful, sophisticated, and different, and bringing that into the lives of the people who use the space. And I don't think it would have been thought of as like an aggressive or partisan kind of a move, if that makes sense.